Hello and welcome to the third of the World War I British political history video lessons. The usual disclaimer before we begin, this will not cover the specific information that you need in order to do well at the exam. It only is the analysis and argument making which is difficult to find in the reading. You will need to use the readings in the K-Drive to find the relatively easy stats, facts and statistics and examples, in order to back up what you're saying. So what we're going to be doing in this lesson is focusing on something which could be either two separate questions or one combined question. And it's essentially how World War I affects different groups in society. Now in particular we're looking at how World War I affects the position of workers and of women. So if we recap what life was like before these both groups, before 1914, before World War I. With the workers, it's a story of increasing radicalism, organisation and confidence. They are increasingly dissatisfied with the status quo. Not necessarily with capitalist democracy, they fundamentally support that, but they think the system is unfairly weighted towards the employers, the rich, and they are campaigning and fighting through increasing politicisation and, more commonly, their unions, for equal wages or better wages, better working conditions, and to some extent also are expecting and demanding a degree of welfare from the state. And this can be seen in the rise of union membership, the increasing strikes that we look at 1910 to 1913, and the increasingly antagonistic relationship unions have with bosses, and the increasing willingness of workers to strike. So essentially what's happening here is workers are kicking out for change, but there's not really a sense that there's meaningful or significant change, and the unions lose strikes as often as they win them, and therefore there's still a lot of dissatisfaction. Similarly, women are increasingly showing radicalism, increasingly campaigning for political equality, but fundamentally there has been a complete lack of progress. Arguably progress has gone backwards if you're anti-suffragette, and essentially therefore they are in a second-class situation in society which is underpinned by a sense of gender roles, a sense of femininity which inherently infantilizes, inherently therefore dismisses women as equal adults in society, and casts them more as innocent, naive, somewhat unintelligent, childlike beings who should be protected from the corruption of the world, i.e. not given the right to vote, and should be kept in the domestic sphere. Okay, and therefore they are fundamentally alienated from political society, and political society doesn't really want to deal with them either. And so both groups have reasons to have complaints as a result of World War I. So you could argue that total war would only make these situations worse. As the privation of war and as people have to spend the government has to spend more money on fighting a war, that's less money on welfare. There will be more economic hardships, as we explored in theory, as a result of the war, and then and unions arguably will take this as an opportunity to strike for more better wages and better conditions, which in turn will lead to a government reaction, which in turn often leads to alienation of the unions and radicalisation in the working class. So that's what could happen. Women as well, they have been ignored. Up until 1914, the war gives a brilliant excuse to continue ignoring women and making no real change. So you can argue, therefore, the total war situation should make relations between the workers and the rest of society, workers and the government, women and the rest of society, women and the government, worse. So the key question to some extent is, what does the government do to avoid aggravating these two groups? Essentially, the approach it takes is different for each group. It spends a lot more time trying to pacify the workers and keep the workers on side than it does women. In that women, number one, don't seem to require as much pacification, but more than that, and workers are a greater and organised threat to stability and the war effort. If they all strike, the war effort will be particularly affected, whereas women are helpful to war effort but not seen as essential. So the government has to actively work to keep both sides or both groups happy. Now, as they will spend much more time and effort on workers, they will do bits here and there for women, but women actually, as we shall see, are relatively self-organising, self-disciplined in that regard. So the government policy towards these groups, as we have already seen in the last two lessons, is to mitigate the effects of the war on the poorer groups in society by making sure that rationing happens, by making sure there is support, increased welfare, by making sure there is feeding happening for the workers, making sure that workers' pay is increasing. That is ideally and designed to some extent to prevent the workers from being too excessive in their demands and being increasingly militant. If the workers feel like their pay is significantly affected, they are far more likely to strike. The government, by helping push wages up, is helping avoiding strikes. The government as well is fundamentally conciliatory towards the government and always aims to try and make deals with the unions as opposed to fight them. Now, if a union goes on strike, the government essentially has two options. Make a deal, and which will often cost money, but lead to industrial peace and increased production. Or it can say the strikes are unpatriotic, the strikes are affecting the war effort, and perhaps use force to clamp down on it. The former is argue what better to keep the peace. The latter is often the more emotional reaction to it. And usually what happens when a government does that is it just becomes counterproductive, because the unions then become more militant in the face of a government crackdown. The government then has pressure on it from people who believe what the government's saying, and they're to not negotiate, so then they can't negotiate in the future. And this leads to a relative spiral of militancy, government harsh reaction militancy, into political extremism. Additionally, as we will see, and as we have seen, in some workers, actually, because they are desperately needed by the war effort, if you remember the farm workers and engineers, they actually are given significantly higher wages in order to encourage them to work. This in turn leads to them getting greater pay. Now, the government could seem to and try and restrain that force, stop the pay of workers getting too high. This would save money, and arguably this would keep the class system closer, but if they did that, that might lead to conflict with the workers, and they generally avoid that. So what essentially happens is the government is trying very hard to make deals with the unions and mitigate the worst effects of the war, the economic effects of war on the workers, therefore to discourage strikes. So in reality, the war significantly alters the economy and the economic situation of Britain. When you recruit a load of people into the army, you lose workers and they need to be replaced. And to some extent you can use women, but not always. Okay, in particular, you tend to lose the skilled workers. Unskilled workers tend to be from the poorer echelons of society. They tend to be unhealthy and therefore ineligible for fighting in the army. Skilled workers tend to be a bit more right-wing and patriotic and therefore tended to volunteer for war service more commonly. What this meant was that the skilled workers, on balance, disproportionately were overrepresented in the armed forces, which means in that gap you've got all these unskilled workers. Therefore we need much more workers, and also we need more workers who can do skilled jobs, and as we shall see in a second, that's a problem. Additionally, as it's a total war, you need to make sure that you can build more stuff. To build more stuff, you need more factories. More factories needs more jobs. So again, there's more demand for labour, and therefore unemployment is very, very low. Usually less, and hovers around 1%, which in reality is as close to full employment as an economy can reasonably get. And so this actually has incredibly positive effects for the unions. If there is a shortage of labourers, of workers, then unions have a lot of power. If there's a lot of workers and there's lots of unemployment, unions are weak. This is because people are far more likely to go on strike, and bosses are far more likely to know that they're going to lose if there's absolutely no way that someone else will take their job. And there's always an option to get another job if needs be. Whereas if you go on strike, but the boss is happy that he can just hire a whole lot of new people because there's so many people unemployed, then the strike tends not to go well. So because there's very, very low unemployment, the power of unions really, really develops. And so by July 1919, if you look at the average wages of the bricklayers, dockers, agricultural workers and coal miners, i.e. people fundamentally involved in the war effort, but also relatively low skilled jobs, their wages are up 90%. Although that's not massive, because also part of the wages are lost because of inflation, that is still a significant rise. So what we see, therefore, is because there's increased demand for workers, there's greater pay, but unions also increasingly agitate for more pay as well because they know they have the power. And as already mentioned, the governments habitually give in, or at least make deals and compromises with the unions. But it's not always good. There are some industries, as you've mentioned before, where the economy of war does not benefit them. The export industries, industries which make money by selling stuff abroad, cannot physically sell nearly as much stuff abroad because most of the boats are being used by the British government to bring in war supplies and food. Therefore, cannot be used to send goods out. And therefore there's less money coming into those industries, and therefore them in those industries either have to close or reduce the salary, or more commonly not rise the salary along with the price rises of food of their workers. And the cotton workers are particular examples of this, with their wages only going up by 60%. And again, the biggest people who see the biggest gains are the unskilled labourers. Okay, because of the war, and as we shall see in a second, there is an agreement between the unions and the government. Up until this point, the unions were jealously guarding the right of skilled labour to not be replaced by unskilled labour. So if you have someone who is a boilermaker who's very skilled, the union tended to control how many people were trained as a boilermaker and who could work as a boilermaker. If you let anyone work as a boilermaker, soon you can pay anyone to work as a boilermaker really cheaply. And that means those skilled workers who have learned over the years how to be a boilermaker will either be out of a job or have to be paid less. So if you as a union threaten industries to say you will either take skilled labourers or we will strike, it is a good way to make sure there's not that many people who can actually make boilers, and therefore you can ask for a lot of money in return for being a skilled labourer who can make boilers. What the agreement with the Treasury gets, as we shall see, is an agreement from unions that temporarily the government can employ unskilled labourers to do skilled labourers' jobs, engineering, for example, boiler making, etc., in order to help the war effort. And with the idea that it will go back to normal once the war is over. Now, naturally, this means the unskilled labourers who are now doing these skilled labour jobs are paid more because they are now doing a slightly more valuable job. So essentially what we're seeing here is, and we've mentioned a lot of this before in the last lessons, we're not going to dwell too much on it, is there's a rise in average salaries and at least not so much of a loss of the income and the economic situation of the poor, although it is a mixed bag, with some groups more affiliated with the war doing better than groups who are affiliated with the exports. So when we look at industrial relations, in 1915 Lloyd George signs the Treasury Agreement. Okay, and this agreement was between Lloyd George and the unions, and this deal said that in return for not striking, okay, the unions would keep work going and not strike, which will help the war effort, but in return any dispute between the employers and the unions would have to be agreed and settled by an independent judge or arbitration. Okay. They also agreed, as I mentioned, that unskilled workers can temporarily do the jobs of skilled workers. This is called dilution, but it would go back to the old system at this point. So you can see at this point the unions are being relatively patriotic. In this deal, the government does better. And what Lloyd George really pushes to get the unions to get this deal is this idea of helping the war effort in the short term, and it will go back to normal in the long term. Okay, so the unions, to some extent, are willing to sacrifice to a reasonable degree, although they clearly do not fully trust the employers to keep up their end of the bargain, hence the reason they want independent arbitration. And they are therefore sacrificing the immediate interests of their members in order to help David Lloyd George. Now, in reality, the year after, shortly after, there's the Munitions Act 1915, which makes it illegal to strike. We're going to talk about it in a little bit more details, but in reality, although that makes it illegal to strike initially only for munitions workers, but then it's expanded to other industries, very, very few people are actually prosecuted on this. Okay, and even though there's a lot of people striking, and the reason the government doesn't prosecute it is if you make it illegal to strike but don't enforce it, that can only annoy the working class to a certain extent. But if you start throwing people in prison for striking, particularly if the working classes think the strike is actually quite legitimate and there is a legitimate claim, you are going to explode the situation. It's going to get far, far more radical, and you're going to have far, far more of a negative reaction. And remember that the government's approach towards the unions and towards the workers is to be as gentle and as kid gloves as possible in order to keep them on side. Now, in reality, there are pressures on unions to strike, particularly as the war goes on. During the middle part of the war, inflation is around 25%, which means that your wages are increasing, eroding as time goes on. Okay, and therefore, this pressure on inflation, which is not kept up with wages naturally, leads to a large number of strikes. So, for example, 2 weeks after the Treasury Agreement, 200,000 miners went on strike to get more money. And actually what happened was the government, rather than say, you promised us the Treasury Agreement, they pressured the mine owners to give in and give a pay rise. Because to some extent the mine owners were in the wrong and they needed to give the pay rise to some extent. Okay, so what we see here is a really uneasy agreement, not uneasy, very sort of double-sided agreement to some extent. There is officially an agreement not to strike. However, there is a massive increase in the number of strikes. Many of them are quote-unquote unofficial, so that the unions can say they're keeping up their end of the bargain. But the government knows that most people involved organising the strikes are just the same people in the unions. They're just not saying they're from the union at this point. But to keep the peace, they choose to tactically ignore this, and they basically instead try and resolve it by getting the employers to make deals. And this is a very key distinction. This is why, to some extent, industrial unrest, although strike days increase, industrial tension and anger doesn't really increase in any meaningful way, because the government isn't getting involved and using its powers as it could, and actually to some extent the miners are getting what they wanted. And what we see is that pattern continued as David Lloyd George becomes Prime Minister and increasingly nationalises and takes control of industry. And because the government is now in charge of by 1917, in charge of the mining, the coal mines and the railways, the government starts making direct deals with the unions to keep the peace, but which also benefit the unions. And so in reality the miners by the 1918 have got national pay rates, something they've wanted forever, which is basically the idea that rather than getting paid miners differently in different areas, which is designed to encourage competition and divide and rule, you pay them everyone the same no matter where they are. They also have the average working week reduced from 55 to 45 hours, and again this is part of the deal with the government. And the dockers who had been taken over by the government, the people who move stuff on and off ships essential for a war effort, were decasualised. What that means is, rather than getting paid on the day, i.e. if there was a boat you got a job and you got paid, if there wasn't a boat you went home and didn't get paid, you now had a wage no matter if there was a boat or not. So in reality the government is desperately trying to keep the unions on side by although they have the power to crack down on the strikes, by choosing not to and instead trying to get the mine owners to conciliate. Now in reality there is still a rise in strikes. Inflation is rising at such a pace that union after union has to get its members pay up or they will significantly fall behind. And so we have 5.7 million strike days lost in 1917 alone, which isn't as bad as it was in 1912, but isn't great, and is a rise. And also there's violence on the Clyde side, always the Clyde side, against the being illegal to strike clause in the Munition Act. And a couple of people are beaten up, and the troops are sent in, although no one is shot, on the express orders of Lloyd George. So again, it is not a beautiful partnership where everyone does what they want. There is rough edges, there are still strikes, there is still violence, but by and large, considering how bad it could be, it is significantly better and doing much better than what's happening in Germany at this point. So essentially, why don't the relations with the workers sour? Why doesn't the war, which should significantly alter the economic situation, should make the unions more bold and therefore lead to more industrial unrest? Why does that lead to that? Well, fundamentally, it's because the government does not want to escalate this problem. They do not enforce the ban on striking. They do not crack down too harsh on the strike days. They do not punish people on strike so much. They encourage the employers to make they wanted the employers to sort of make deals, and they pressured, once they owned the industries that were nationalised, they made deals directly with the unions to avoid any issues. Their response was, it depends on your point of view, was either conciliation or you can say just abject surrender. Because ultimately their objective wasn't really to keep workers in their place. I mean, it'd be good if that happened, but in reality they want peace. Domestic peace, calmness at home, so everyone is just focused on the war effort. This has a key political reason, i.e. if you are trying to fight a war and there is violence between the unions and the government at home, that can only hurt the war effort and lead potentially to rebellion or revolution. And economic reasons, the more days people go on strike, the less stuff you're making for a war. So the government usually gives in to strike demands, or at least makes a compromise. And the important thing to realise that it's not simply just greedy unionists pushing all the way, as the Treasury Agreement 1915 shows, and as the fact that when the government offers a compromise, most union leaders agree to the compromise rather than demand what they originally asked for. The unionists are not radicals. They don't want to use strikes to destroy society. They don't want to use the strikes in order to bring down the capitalistic system. What they are looking to do is just make sure their members do not get hurt too much by the effects of the war on the economy, particularly inflation. And so, because they are not looking to destabilise, they can be negotiated with, and they can particularly have the patriotic sense of sacrifice made to appeal to them. So they will hold back some demands, and they do pull back some demands, some unions more than others, but some demands, in order to show patriotism, and in most cases, because they believe this actually leads to patriotism, in order to help the war effort. So they actually demand far less extreme stuff as well, and they are more willing to compromise. So essentially, the war, where it should just only continue the unrest and problems, in fact make worse the problems of 1910 to 1914, in reality do not, because the government just conciliates more, gives more money, the unions are a little bit more a little bit less radical, and therefore there is just an uneasy alliance thing going on, where there are strike days, but ultimately there is not too much labour unrest. So that is the working classes, essentially. You need to get lots of specific evidence from that, of all these examples, and you need to be able to explain why isn't there so much radicalism. You will have sources which say it's a crazy revolution these people are betraying, but in reality, for all the rhetoric, people cracked on and made deals, etc., compromise on what's important, mitigating in advance, etc. So what about the effects of the war on women? Now this is on unions. Well, this is fairly controversial. Essentially, unions reached their peak by 1918. In 1910 we have 2.5 million. In 1918 we have 6.5 million. This is more than double. The reason the number of people in the unions goes up is because they work. They get better pay, so more people join them. And in reality, that number will drop as soon as, after the general strike, people start doubting whether unions can get any change. Okay? Basically, the relative success of the unions, which was, gained its members. Why were the unions successful? Because the government were being friendly in their policy, and the level of unemployment was low, which meant they had the power, which means they could get what they wanted. Okay? So essentially, unions played a very, very good game. Most strikes which actually happened were unofficial. In reality, they weren't. So the strike would happen, but the unions could still present themselves as patriotic, and therefore trying to hopefully mitigate this image that the trade unions are radicals. So therefore, the war overall on unions is a broadly positive experience. They come out of this, if you think about the Labour Party, with a stronger Labour Party, they come out of this with, on average, better conditions for their members, less so for the skilled members, and they come out of this with an increasingly better deal from the government. Now, for women's rights, things are a little bit different, and again, you need to get the specific evidence for this. But essentially, women sacrifice significantly towards the war effort. Now, do not say that every woman who works is volunteering patriotically. Some women are working in factories simply because that's what you need to do to keep the family fed when the husband is away on meagre war salary, army salary. So in reality, while there are massive voluntary works done by the women, it's primarily the middle class women who are doing that volunteering stuff, and usually more on patriotic grounds, whereas the working class women tend to focus a little bit more on just getting enough money to survive, getting enough money to pay off the rising cost of food. And although obviously many of them are patriotic, there's less of a sense of sacrifice for the country. It's more about surviving to some extent. But despite the fact that women are volunteering and women are working hard, they are still paid less in the factories, and in fact the unions demand this. Remember, unions are dominated by men who are deeply suspicious of women being drawn in to increase employment and employable people, and therefore undercut that massive strength the unions have. If you double the workforce, that power you have because there's no other workers doesn't work anymore. The government, despite the fact that women are patriotic, self-sacrificing, and there's a lot of rhetoric, and if there's a question comes up on this one, they're going to have someone saying something very proud and patriotic about how brilliant women are. Or despite all the rhetoric and all the things people are saying about how wonderful women's sacrifice are and how wonderful women are, there's no real sense or evidence to show that women are being viewed as anything different to what they were viewed as before. That women themselves by and large, see themselves as much more independent, much more deserving of a right to vote, or particularly that men see women as equals. There's not really the evidence there. As we'll talk about it in a second, as soon as the war is over, most women are kicked out of their jobs and replaced by men and sent back to the home. And in fact, the government still uses, and you find evidence of this, propaganda to emphasise motherhood and domesticity. As we've mentioned, they're deeply concerned that they need to replace these lost men killed in the war, and therefore really encourage motherhood, really encourage women staying in the home. So while women are working and women are sacrificing, it is far too crude to say that women are actually being more respected or being owed a moral debt for their sacrifice, because in reality men don't seem to have changed their opinion. They kick them out of jobs, they expect them to go in their home, that women are still treated poorly. There are no laws about equal pay, there are no laws about how one can treat a woman, there are no laws about divorce. Nothing changes in terms of the social attitudes if you look at the law. So in reality, since that the patterns of what the different genders should do, what women's place was and what their role was and what kind of person, what made the ideal woman, because that did not shift, it's difficult to say the war had a profound effect on women's rights. Most people who argue that World War I helped women get the right to vote point to the October 1916 Special Parliamentary Committee. And this is a committee of various parties who sit down and say, well, after the war we are going to have to discuss electoral reform, we're going to have to increase the size of the vote, and it was mostly focused on giving them more votes to working class men. But as part of that, there was an agreement that some women, only women of certain property and women of certain economic status and age, should be given the right to vote. Now, the important thing to realise is two things. Words are cheap. There is not an accident that in the middle of a major war where tons and tons of working class men are dying, that the government is starting to say, oh yeah, let's talk about having you guys getting a vote after the war. It's a desperate attempt to some extent to reassure working classes that the government's on their side, and therefore almost dangle a little carrot to keep women and workers working hard for the war effort and sacrificing for the war effort, because there's this temptation and this image that perhaps the life will get equal and the world will get better after the war. Just because they say it doesn't mean it will actually happen. Now, it does actually happen, but that's usually for different reasons. So the first thing you should point out is a lot of this is as much propaganda as it is an actual committee which is designed to make a law. And it's also worth pointing out that even if they did mean it entirely, women still don't get the full equal rights to men in this voting habits. Only the rich and older women doing it, and we'll talk about why that is, and that shows how flawed the argument that men feel like a debt of allegiance to women because of their sacrifice. So women are essentially contributing in the war effort, volunteering in the war effort, but despite the fact there is some warm, fuzzy rhetoric about how women have deserved the right to vote coming from Asquith, who's trying to rebrand himself after the leadership struggle, etc., etc., there's no evidence that most men have changed their opinion of women. So essentially, one of the key questions which gets asked is, why then do women get the right to vote in 1918? And there's a big argument that World War I is key to getting women the right to vote. Now this links to a lot of what we spoke about in the previous lesson when we talked about women's rights. Essentially, you can argue World War I gave women the right to vote, but in reality it didn't. Okay, one argument is that the World War I proves to men that women can do it, women are tough, like a Pixar movie, it's a little train that can, and therefore they gain the grudging respect of the vote. Very Disney. Unfortunately, that's absolute rubbish. Okay, there's no evidence to suggest men respected women any more beyond semantics. If they respected women, they would have given them an equal job place in society. They would have at least given them equal voting, but only certain women get the right to vote. They wouldn't have kicked them out of all their jobs when they came back. So there's not really a sense of women deserving it, and deserving it beyond the woolly sort of, oh yeah, they weren't bad, which doesn't explain why you do such a radical policy. Okay, you can also argue that women increasingly undertaking male tasks, going out and being independent, changes what it meant to be a woman, what the ideal woman was. Now, there's not much evidence that it actually changed men's opinion of what a woman can and cannot do and what an ideal woman was. There's slightly more evidence that for some women it really helped create a sense of independence and a sense that actually their life could be different rather than what has been prescribed by the gender roles. But again, those women, there's not much evidence to suggest that they actually did much pressuring of the government. The women get the right to vote before the women's suffrage movement really starts again. So that change of mind, however many women it affected, probably didn't massively change didn't massively have an effect on the government. Because if all these women change their minds, but they're not protesting, how the hell can that have an effect on the government? Similarly, you can argue that it makes women more independent and assertive to demand the vote, okay, and that unifies them and makes their call irresistible. Now, in reality, as I just mentioned, there's no public calls for women to get the right to vote. There's no mass calls for women to get the right to vote after the war, because in reality, women get the vote pretty quickly after the war ends, before an organisation and a mass call can form. Now you can argue that's because the government saw it coming and had to cut it off at the heels, and there might be an element of that. But again, if that's true, why didn't they give all women the right to vote? Some argue that women are given the right to vote because they were patriotic and they sacrificed for the war effort, and therefore they were paying a debt. Morally and in terms of rhetoric, that might be true, but again, why didn't all women get the vote? The vast majority of women who worked in the factories were young, poor women who didn't, in the end, get the right to vote. Okay? You can argue as well that the war almost gave space for the suffragettes to be forgotten about. If you remember, one of the big things blocking the rise of the women's suffrage campaign and the rise of the support for women's suffrage was the fact that the suffragettes had been using violence, and therefore the government said, we are not going to negotiate with violence. And if you look at the number of MPs who supported women's rights to vote, it only decreased from the rise of militant action. You can argue that what the war does is, number one, it makes people hate the suffragettes less because they so quickly and patriotically stopped the campaign, appealing to national unity. But more than that, 4 years and a major war has elapsed. People have forgotten the specifics and the anger of suffragettes, and therefore it has less effect on their thinking and their objections. So what you can say is that what the war does do is actually it shifts and removes the damage that the suffragettes had done. So, if we are looking then to explain why did the women's suffrage movement, why did women get the right to vote in 1918, you cannot ignore the war, because it's just far too convenient for women to get a vote straight after the World War I, when they had no chance before. Any answer should reflect the long-term changes and the slow persuasion of changing in attitudes as a result of the actions of the suffragists. The actions of the suffragettes, which you can either sell as counterproductive, largely useless but good for grabbing attention for the debate, even if that is largely negative, and or you can describe them as fundamentally forcing the government to change its mind by making it do unpopular actions like the Cat and Mouse Act. As we've already mentioned, that's not true. You can also characterise World War I as a hugely transformative event. Now, it's not, but you can try and argue it. You can say, for example, that what the war does is it transforms women's sense of gender, it transforms women's independence, which therefore makes them far more strong advocates that the government fear and therefore feel like they have to placate. You can also say it provides at least the rhetoric and the moral cover to give women the right to vote, even if your reasons are otherwise. If you are giving the women the reasons for one reason, but you want to make it like you are being patriotic, you can say it's because they had done so well during the war. In reality, a convincing argument for why women get the right to vote has nothing to do with women at all. You cannot send the bottom 30% of society who don't have the right to vote into their bloody death in the mud of the Somme and then not give them the right to vote. Not even the Tories would be able to argue that they could try and avoid giving the working class bottom end of male society the vote because of their sacrifices. It's so easy to be attacked as hypocritical, allowing someone to be British when they want when they're dying in the mud, but not be British when it comes to voting for their government. So in reality, what the war does is it changes the situation into one where universal manhood suffrage is pretty much inevitable. And so what this does is this terrifies the liberals and, more importantly, the conservatives. Because now you are massively increasing the electorate amongst people who will probably never vote for you and almost certainly vote for Labour or the Liberals. So there is an argument which says the reason the women get the right to vote in 1918 is to balance the men getting the right to vote. Now, if you think about who is allowed to vote as a result of 1918 Representation of the People Act, it is the rich, older women. These women are far more likely to vote Conservative. So if you get these women to vote, at the same time as you get all these working class men to vote, you are basically balancing it out. And this is perhaps explains most commonly, as well as that, and you can also explain it by sort of this traditional gender view that women are responsible. This explains more closely why only some women, rich, older, upper class women, are given the right to vote. And so in reality, they can also say there's a political consideration here. So how you answer this is up to you. You need to keep these core elements. Don't just say it was the war, the suffragettes, the suffragists, whichever one. You need to show a combination. I would contend that there is a growing sympathy naturally as a result of socio-economic change, which is only helped by the suffragists and their peaceful campaigning. But these suffragist campaigners are deeply flawed because they never forced the government to make a change. The suffragettes, in reality, are largely counterproductive, and they give the moral cover for government to stop any reform. And indeed, the government reaction that's forced upon women does not motivate more people to support the suffragettes in any meaningful way. Perhaps what the suffragettes are, one thing they're good at, is bringing the debate into the public consciousness. If you think about Donald Trump, everyone talks about the American presidency. Everyone knows about American politics a lot more, even if no one supports it. And you can argue by having something which everyone talks about, even if it isn't positive, does bring into people's minds the idea that it might be acceptable at some point that women should have the right to vote. It gives them a reason to have an opinion on the issue. And once someone has an opinion and thinks about an issue, it's easier then to change their mind to agree with you. Yeah? It's hard to get someone to change their mind on something they don't really care about or think about. Something they do think about is easier to discuss. So that, plus the effects of war, which have a massive change and basically mean that working class men have to get the right to vote, plus for some people perhaps a genuine feeling of patriotic debt, and a feeling that women perhaps deserve the right to vote, which either motivates only a few people or more likely gives a moral cover to people who are actually thinking about crass politics to give women the vote. Put that together with the crude political calculation the Tories and Liberals are making about balancing the working class vote, and you have a reason. So this answer should really show how the factors build on to each other. You cannot say the war is ultimately pointless, but you must avoid and really try and take a hatchet to this to show off to an examiner how you are thinking more broadly than everyone else. The arguments that men suddenly respected women as a result of World War One because they would make marital rape illegal, but it's not. They would make divorce equal, but they don't. They would not ban them from most professions or university education, but they continue to do so. So this image that women suddenly are treated as equals is absolute rubbish, and very conveniently neat and ties it up. So headlines: workers should be rebelling, not rebelling because the government are being very conciliatory and not using their coercive power, and deciding instead to use conciliation. Women, no change, self-sacrifice more for the middle classes, less of a political act of the working classes. Women get the right to vote, probably not because of the war. That is the headline. Okay, next lesson, we are going to be looking at the rise of the Labour Party and the fall of the Liberals in the war, and that will be the end of the part 1 video lessons. 30 out of 50 marks on your exam paper covered. So until then, I will see you in the next video.